So I'm going to try and be super fast. The basic question is whether harvesting wood, or when does harvesting wood for construction material actually kind of benefit from a climate perspective? And so this is kind of a model that we've developed, but it's not dissimilar from a lot of other models that look at this type of stuff. And so if you start with one, kind of the counterfactual is you basically leave the wood in the forest. You imagine a middle-aged forest that continues to grow for a while and accumulates carbon. And if instead you cut it down and the forest regrows, you get this kind of carbon stock from the forest regrowth. And then you add the fact that you have slash stuff, starts, you leave it there originally, but it decays over time. You have wood that is stored in the product that you use. And this, of course, is a key factor, is what percentage. If you have, these are the percentages that we have developed from kind of typical uses of wood. So it's not necessarily the ideal use of wood. And you have, some is basically burned quickly, some goes into paper, short-lived products is basically paper, and then maybe 30% goes into construction. Then you have the material that goes into long-lived products displaces other material, concrete and steel, and you get a benefit from that. And here we're using a substitution factor that's kind of a mid-range estimate, or actually the kind of average estimate that's come of 1.2 to 1, which means for every ton of carbon in the wood, you save 1.2 tons of carbon in concrete and steel. But you see a lot of numbers that are a lot lower. For example, actually in the paper by Jacquina that was mentioned, I think it's more like 0.5, but this is 1.2. And then over time, wood gets thrown away. Here we're assuming it goes into a landfill, and then you kind of get some storage, but some decay in the landfill. And in this case, in this kind of average example, the actual carbon implications are that it's negative for the environment, it's negative for the climate. And here, the key thing that we're doing, so this is kind of the overlay of what would happen if you didn't harvest the wood. And the key thing that we're doing is we're applying a 4% discount rate, which basically says we value mitigation that occurs earlier more than mitigation that occurs later. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and that can be debated exactly how much. But if we didn't do that, we wouldn't be so worked up about trying to stabilize the climate by 2050. And I think the general theory, if you can present this in simple language, is we're trying to buy time. We're trying to keep the climate from going too far out of whack while we develop the political will and the technology to be able to completely stabilize the climate. So we value mitigation earlier rather than later. Now that was an example where there's a net cost. Here's an example where you actually take a secondary forest, you convert it to a high yielding plantation, and then you use the wood for in the same ways, and you get a net gain. So it depends on your scenario from a pure carbon standpoint. And this will give you some, but let me just say, of course, when converting to plantations has a big biodiversity implication, generally losing about 50% or more of the species at least. People know that. But the numbers matter. So this was a paper by Chen et al., basically a kind of Canadian researchers, where they had different numbers. And in this case, 70% of the timber that's harvested gets into construction material. And they had a very, very high substitution value for concrete and steel. And if that's true, then here you can you don't really even have a payback period. You get a kind of immediate benefit for a structural panel. For lumber, it takes 21 years before you get a net greenhouse gas reduction. So it means you've increased emissions to 21 years and 39 years if it's a non-structural panel. So the point is that the numbers matter. And these are, I think, the critical parameters. So how fast does your forest grow, harvested or unharvested? A really, really big factor is what percentage of the wood gets removed from the forest. And then another really, really big factor is the percentage of that wood that actually gets into construction material. That was kind of key to the Chen results. And then how much concrete and steel is actually substitute, what the relative emissions. And I said, it's very hard to kind of track this down. You know, the papers where people have been very specific about what they're doing, generally in the kind of 0.5 category, the Chen was more over 2. So that matters too. So let me just close by saying just a couple quick things. So in the Chen paper, they hypothesized that this would be beneficial even on a global basis if you could get all of their high levels of substitution and use, because they assumed you have a bunch of kind of managed forests in Canada that are well managed, well harvested, and that are not presently likely to be used for other wood products. So it's kind of like a surplus of well managed forests that you could then manage and harvest in a very high efficiency. And one question about that is there's another big issue, and that is, how are we going to meet all of the wood product demand? So we're basically looking, even without bioenergy or construction timber, at about a 50% increase in wood product demand by about 2050 from 2010. And it's uncertain, but a lot on a global basis. And that is a huge increase in demand. I think construction timber, if we use the numbers from Jerkina, to get 50% of new urban construction would basically require about 50% more wood. And there was a wide range, but of possible numbers. But, you know, so then you're now in the doubling of wood product demand. And so the question, even then with that Canada scenario, isn't that wood already going to be needed to meet rising demand? So where do we actually find a way to get all that wood, assuming we can then have these scenarios like in the Chen where you've got this? And the last thing I'll say is that there are papers, you know, a number of papers that do this calculation this way. The Canadians have generally done it this way. The overwhelming majority of papers that find benefits from construction timber simply don't count the loss of carbon in the forest. In effect, they're treating biomass as automatically carbon-free on the principle that it's kind of sustainable and renewable in the long run. And that is the same issue that's come up in bioenergy. And if you believe that, then it's also good just to harvest massive numbers of trees to burn them, or we shouldn't be recycling paper, this kind of stuff. So I do think that it's correct to count the changes in carbon in the forest because of the timing issue. But I do think that these key issues are important in terms of determining where we can actually, where we can get net gains. So I'll leave it at that.